Hello, welcome to the overview of interior elevations. I will demonstrate a few different things to do on the elevations by looking at this large conference room. Now, most of you are probably already familiar with the command of elevation, but let's look at some particulars how to create preliminary round of your elevations, and then there's always additional three-dimensional information you can add. But because elevations are by their nature a two-dimensional view, a lot of information we can actually show two-dimensionally. But first, let's review the proper way to set up the elevation. So you would go to View and pick the elevation command. And if you're doing all four elevations of an individual room and the room is not too large, you might wish to put the elevation tag in the middle and then have four individual elevations attached to it. However, for larger rooms, I do advise to have four individual elevations set up. There is no way to split them up, and you will lose all of the information of the elevation tag um, if you start deleting the combined tag. But you can always reference the other views later on. So think about how you want to show these elevations and how much information. I generally try to keep my elevation tags split up to give me the most availability to change things up later on. So I'm gonna start with this wall, and then you would move clockwise around the room. One thing to keep in mind how you're laying out these elevations on the sheet later on. So pick the corner, usually on the northern side that you're gonna, or northern elevation you're gonna start with, and then this would be the first elevation. This would go right next to it because they share a corner. So how you're placing them on a sheet would be essentially like you're unraveling the elevation, like you're opening up the box. So this would be first, second, third, and fourth. Don't try to alphabetize them by the orientation. That doesn't always work out the best. Another thing I wanted to point out is the range of the elevation. So each elevation might have a range within the room automatically set like this one, and then it has the depth. And make sure the depth doesn't capture too much beyond just the room. And you would do the same adjustment for all of the elevations. So keep the elevation within the two walls, or feet of the wall, and then make sure the outside border is not too far out either. Like this one is capturing the wall behind it, which you really don't want to see and don't want to process that information. And same thing here. So that is about the range. Now let's look at how to set up the crop border of each one of the elevation. Elevations in Revit, it's usually set come at about 80% or sometimes less, like in case of this one, out of the box just when you create it. So the first thing you'll need to do is making sure that your outline is showing the correct border of the room. And in this particular case, once I looked up, I can see that there is a pop in the ceiling, right? So there's articulation. But the reason why we have the elevation so close to the border is because I actually have border around the wall that does not go up. So my cut line is then actually going to be at a lower ceiling level. But again, if you're cutting an elevation and the whole room has a pop-up, and you don't have the consistent edge around the perimeter like I do in this room, then that pop-up, that crop would be shown here as well. And we're going to look in a moment how to adjust the crop. And then make sure you're just grabbing the edge of the floor at the floor line and not too much of the floor. Here we have slightly thicker line because we modeled the floor earlier on. So that's the first step. We have the correct crop. Next, grid lines and levels will always show up, and you don't want them to show up. So we'll go to Visibility Graphics and Annotation Categories, and you want to turn off, you do want to keep most of them on. We will need dimensions and tags and other things, but grids and levels you want to turn off. And then also elevations can be done at two different scales, 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch when you're showing more detail. So 3/8 of an inch are really popular for full-size sets, 1/4 inch larger elevations, and also smaller 11 by 17 sheets like what you're working on right now. So let's keep them at 1/4 inch for now. So we got this slight scaling. Now finally, you don't want to be turning off levels and grids on each and every elevation. You're creating a lot of them. So I'm going to use this opportunity to go to the view template and create a template from current view. So when I create a new elevation, I can automatically apply the 1/4 inch scaling, turning off grids and levels. I'll still need to adjust the crop, but at least this information is going to be automatic. So I'm going to call it interior elevation and 1/4 inch just to denote in case I have 3/8 of an inch later on in the same file. And now it tells me all of the different, so anything that's checked is going to be included, and you can customize what kind of parameters are included in that template. So once I apply this template to another view, all of these settings will automatically show up. And then finally, the crop border does not always print properly. And depending when you're catching it, you might get a thicker line, thinner line. So there is a quick visibility override. You will right click after clicking on a border and override the graphics by element. You might remember this to make sure your elevations are printing nicely and correctly. You'll have to remember at the print time to uncheck the box that automatically turns off the crop border. So we want this to be black line, and we want a 5-point border. It's a pretty heavy border, as heavy as you want to go in the elevation, but as you can see, it gives us a nice outline and no differences in the thicknesses along the edges. So once you set up the elevation, make sure you create the crop around it so you're not catching any wall or floor thicknesses, because if you're cutting through walls or floors, you have a section and not an elevation. And you override the crop line to set it to 5-point black line, and make sure your print settings reflect the crop line being turned on, not automatically being turned off. And then finally set your visibility graphics to turn off levels, grids, and to expedite the process, create a template so you can do that quickly in the future. So now that we have the basic elevation set up, let's look at some of the things we might annotate in our elevations. Now at first, a lot of your elevations might look blank like this. Now no elevation is going to be completely blank, so let's go to the Annotate tab and grab a detail line. And generally we annotate with thin lines. And put in one thing that each one of your elevations is going to have, and that is going to be your base. Just putting in a line for the base. Typical floor base height is, so there are 6-inch ones or 4-inch ones. 4-inch one is fairly common. A 6-inch one is a little bit higher, a little bit nicer. And then you can have taller custom ones, but 4-inch is as low as it gets, and it is probably the most common one in commercial spaces. So every elevation at a minimum is going to have this, and we usually don't model this unless we have some specific base condition and we have that modeled for a 3D walkthrough or something. So that would be the baseline. Now another thing in a conference room like we have, you might want to have acoustical wall panels. So you could model those again if you need a three-dimensional view, but just for the elevation, we can start with some detail lines. And I generally start with the detail lines because it lets me actually finish off the design. If you're thinking about more elaborate design of a room, you might actually even go back and design it on sketch paper, which is a good strategy for any elevation, any room that has a lot of different wall components that need to be coordinated. Another thing on the wall panels you might consider, I have glazing and doors at 8 feet, so I might want to have a horizontal line, and I might want to have another horizontal line further down at the casework or chair rail height or anything that's going to be inset into the wall. So let's and you can dimension these later or you can dimension them now. Dimensioning is not required for this type of the project, but eventually you'll need to dimension all of your elevations. So if you're thinking of the layout, now might be a good time to dimension. So next thing you might be thinking about, like, oh, well, now I have a finish, a fabric that I need to show and annotate. So how would I do that? So an easy way to do that would be simply to use a hatch field region to make sure that you're differentiating this from just a white wall. So your white wall is going to be paint. The 4 inches on the bottom is going to be base. You don't necessarily need to give that a hatch. But anything else beyond that, you could do gray hatches. They don't always show quite as well on the printouts, so you might actually want to create your own filled region for the fabric panel. So I'm going to duplicate whatever I have here and fabric wrap panel or acoustical wall panel, and I'm going to give it let's give it a fairly simple crosshatch. And I don't want it to be masking, I want it to be transparent so it doesn't hide any lines or anything else I might be showing. And then finally I want to use invisible lines so the line of the hatch does not overlap or override in any way the lines that I already created here. So here I am just going to go all the way across. And now I have a hatch, and now I might be looking at this and say, we could just finish these acoustical panels, and I just moved my elevation line. So be very careful how you're selecting things. You can use the tab to make sure you actually select the filled region, or do the overall selection and filter. So I'm deciding that I don't want my acoustical panel to go all the way to the top. And when you're elevating like this is when you start making decisions like that. Now next thing I might be thinking about, I have a piece of equipment here. So you would show the equipment with a hatched line. So using a hidden dash line, I'm just going to put an outline here where my TV screen is going to go. And sometimes when we have things in walls, you might put a cross over it, but cross generally denotes an opening. So just an outline, making sure that the line reads correctly with your hatch, so that you might reconsider having a lighter hatch or a different type of a hatch. Now what this might make me think about is, well, do I want this just mounted on top of the acoustical panel and I would need some power provided behind, or maybe now I'm deciding to redesign and I'm going to adjust my panels and put the back some of the panels I just got rid of right here. And then I'm going to adjust my hatch, my filled region, and create an opening. So now my equipment, my TV screen, is set within the acoustical panels, but it's not definitely on top of the acoustical panel where I would need to be cutting something. So as you're developing these, you'll probably be thinking about what you're putting on a wall and making some decisions and going back and forth, which is another good reason why you just want to use the detail lines and hatches to start off with, and once you have a good layout, then you can go back and model some of these elements for the 3D views, which takes longer and more importantly it's more difficult to change quickly, which might discourage you from changing it up and showing it correctly at the end. Now, finally, one thing I did not do and I should have, and let's see now if I'm going to need to fix it. So I want to make sure that the spacing of my panels is the same, and you can see, oops, they're not all equal. So now when I make them equal, which thankfully wasn't too far off, they looked pretty close. Now I need to adjust my hatch and probably the location of my equipment as well. So even though you don't need to create all of the dimensioning, think about where you want those panels to be and dimensions to be, and it would not hurt to just lay them out and draw them up the way you want to have them in a final iteration, because eventually you will be dimensioning your elevations. And the very last question here, how would you annotate for the assignment that you have? So you can just use a little piece of text, and then for my wall finish, this would be, let's say it's not paint, so this fabric wrap panel is my wall finish type 2. One is probably going to be your paint, and then I can point to the panel on the wall. And then I could point another one to the base, that's another type of a finish. Maybe that would be 2 and this is 3 and so on. So this is really the level of annotation you need for this part of the assignment. And now we'll spend a little bit of time and see what to do when we have a piece of casework to design. So finally, let's look at how we would place casework in our elevations. So let's say I want to place a credenza against this wall. One way I could do it is actually go and place a component and then load a family from the Imperial Library. What you might notice if you're going into this library is that a lot of the cabinets and the look of the cabinet is a very, very residential kitchen look and might not be appropriate for your project. Now, one option is modeling it yourself as an external family and loading it in, which is the perfect solution if you have a piece that repeats multiple times. Or you could go online and download the Architectural Woodward Institute families, or even go to another website. But I would recommend the Architectural Woodwork Institute has quite a variety of families, so I'm going to cancel out of this one. Or if you just have one custom piece, at the first step, I would suggest modeling it in place. I model a lot of the, or most of the custom casework in place because it is just specific to that location. But I will use the Architectural Woodwork Institute for anything that's modular and repetitive, and then there are some parametric families I will create for the projects that kind of fall in between. So, so instead of placing component, I'm going to model it in place, use casework category, and I'm going to call this credenza 1. Assuming I'm going to have more on a project. And then using the extrusion command, I will model the casework in this corner. So first I'm going to model the toe kick area. Now typically casework is about 2 feet deep, and let's say this one I'm going to make it fairly long, so I'm going to make it 14 feet. Okay, and this is 2.5, so the toe kick is actually recessed an additional 3 inches from the full depth. So assuming I want the whole piece of casework, and it is really long, that's why it's looking skinny, to be 2 feet. At the toe kick height, this section is going to be 1 foot and 9 inches. And I have a 4-inch base, so I want my toe kick to line up with the base. So I'm going to start it at 0 and run it to 4 inches, which is the height of my base. Okay, that's the first layer. Then I'm going to create the extrusion on top of that for the for the base of the cabinet, and that should be 2 feet deep. and that will then start at 4 inches and go to underside of the countertop because I want to have an overhanging countertop. So countertop for accessibility is at 210, 34 inches. So an inch and a half thick countertop will bring me to 2 feet and 8.5 inches with my cabinet. And then finally the last layer, I'm going to model the countertop, which will overhang not into the wall, but it will overhang the front edge by 1 inch, and a lot of times it's nice to put the side edge at 1 inch as well. Okay, so turning on the thin lines, I can see they have that overhang, and now I can complete the family. Right, so I have all of the layers here. Let's just see that the countertop, oh yeah, I forgot to elevate it. So the countertop will start at 2.8.5 and end at 2.10. And now we'll just see the countertop in the floor plan. So let's see what my casework looks like. Going to the side elevation. And now I can actually just go and turn on my template. So I'm turning on my interior elevation template. Now I just need to find everything that's in here. So I don't want furniture or lighting or anything like that to be showing. So instead of just changing it here in the visibilities, because I have the template set up, I will go into the actual template and then go to the model overrides and turn off the furniture and furniture systems. This will automatically update it for all of my elevations, which is the nice thing about having the templates. Okay, I'll go back to thick lines. And I can see my cabinet. The only thing that's missing is doors. Don't forget, one thing that the template doesn't override is that border. So make sure you go in and override the border. So that is one thing you do need to do manually for each elevation. So now we can use annotation to show the door and the drawer layout. So let's see what I can come up with. Make sure we're using thin lines. Okay, so I'm drawing all of my door panels. At some point I need to decide if I'm going to have any drawers as well. And because I was just drawing these quickly, I'm going to use the equal command to make sure that they're all equal. Individual door panels are between 1 foot and 2 feet. So these look like they're well within that range. Now I'm thinking, well, maybe right in the middle I can have some horizontal drawers. Could have a big one on the bottom or just narrow ones like that. And in order to denote what is a door in here and what might be a cabinet of the door, what might be the door of a cabinet, rather than just open shelves, I will use the hidden lines to show the swings in the elevation. You don't use any kind of swings or anything for drawers, so that will naturally be conveyed as a drawer. The swings of the cabinets, the hinge side is where the point is. So if you have things swinging up or in other arrangements, you will again, always make sure that the point is where the hinge is. Okay, so what else might we have here? Think about if you have any equipment going on. So with that same dash line, I might denote that one of these cabinets has a piece of equipment. If I have heavy-duty AV, this could be a pull-out small rack running that AV, or I could have a hidden refrigerator and a counter refrigerator small enough to fit in a cabinet there. So this is denoting I need to coordinate something. I have a piece of equipment there that I would eventually annotate on my drawings. So this is how we draw our preliminary casework elevations and for the quick design development views. And then once you have your layout determined, then you can go and model all of these panels three-dimensionally so they would show correctly in 3D views. And there is just one more step left. Think about coordinating the rest of the elevation information now that you set up your casework. So first, I know that I still need to extend the base through the rest of the room. So this is going to be a thin line, not hidden. Then I might consider putting acoustical panels on a wall. If you're putting acoustical panels in a conference room, the best strategy is to put them on two adjacent walls rather than the two opposite walls. Obviously, you could put them on all of the walls, but here, if you remember, we have glazing on two walls, so it would be nice to have panels on these walls. They could go above the countertop. Think about then maybe in addition to everything you drew already, maybe you need a backsplash to protect it. So again, your design develops. This is probably too high. Backsplashes are usually similar to baseboards. They're between 4 and 6 inches. Okay, so let's see, we have that. And then on top of that, maybe we do our fabric wrap panels. I know I have that horizontal line. And the arrangement of the panels that might reflect what I'm doing on the other side. And not forgetting to place my filled region. Okay, well then this is the painted wall and the door opens to it, so this might look pretty good, but don't forget to look at the other elevation. Does the panel arrangement work? Yep, that looks like it might work, but look at this now. Now you have a section of your piece of casework in this elevation. So in order to accommodate that, you would need to crop around it. It is nice that I lined up the panel exactly where the top of the casework is, but maybe we're not thinking about that when you originally placed it, so you might change your panel arrangement and line up here. And also now I added the backsplash, so do I also want a side splash? So maybe I have a side splash here and I change the elevation of that line. Again, coordinate all of those details, and when we're doing the first draft of the elevations, this is when we're making all of these decisions, which is why this first step is done mostly with annotative elements and then modeling the casework as we're going along. So one thing I do know I need to do here is I'm gonna select my crop border, and edit it as I promised in the very first video. And yes, it did load the rest of my malum. So I'm going to crop my view. Remember, we never cut things in elevation that goes for built-in casework, because otherwise there become sections. So I'm going to crop around this element. And now again, I might look at, the layout of the panels. Would it be nicer for the panel to add there, or the overlap like that? And again, going back and forth and refining your design once you're looking at all of the walls and how they relate to one another. Also, don't forget, on the other side, we have glazing. So the next step will probably going to be to look at those panels and the arrangement of those panels and how they relate to your fabric wrap panels. So don't underestimate how much information your walls can contain on a typical project, especially in acoustically sensitive places like conference rooms where you're placing a lot of elements on the walls. And this was the overview of the interior elevations.